Over and over again, the Bible describes God as a builder. He lays the foundations of the world, he stretches out a measuring line, he sets its dimensions. Jesus is described as a carpenter. But what if I told you that the things God is interested in building are not structures, but people? And in this episode, we're going to explore how God invites us to join him in building by building on the right foundation. Let's jump in. Human beings have an innate drive to build. You see this in children when they get their hands on Legos or blocks. They want to build towers and show everybody. You take them to the beach and they're going to build sand castles, or on Saturday morning, build a pillow fort and have their breakfast while they watch cartoons. And this drive to build, it doesn't go away when we grow up. And when you look at the scriptures, what you see is that building is just this key biblical metaphor for the kind of lives that we create. And the fact that this is so deep in us is not incidental to who we are. It's actually one of the ways that we reflect God's character. We build because God is a builder. So let's start in Job chapter 38, where God's having this showdown conversation with Job. And he says to him, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth?" And over the next 6 verses, God is going to continue to ask different variations of this question to Job. And in it, he's going to say, "Hey, where were you when I stretched out the measuring line, or when I laid the cornerstone of the earth, or when I set its footings or measured its dimensions?" And it's like God is envisioning creation as this cosmic construction project. You see the same thing in the book of Proverbs, chapter 8, where wisdom says, "I was formed long ages ago at the very beginning when the world came to be." And then again, over the next 7 verses, you're going to get these lines about the foundation and measuring lines and dimensions. It's all construction, building language. But I love this. At the end of the passage, in Proverbs 8:30, it just says, "Then I, wisdom, was the craftsman at his side." That when God built the world, he had this skilled master builder at his side, and that's me, wisdom. And so you just get this image of God who is a master builder. So the word build in Hebrew is the word bana. It means to build, to rebuild, to make or establish. And when you look at where that word shows up in the Hebrew scriptures, you find some really unexpected things. So for example, God in Genesis 2 builds Eve. He literally constructs her, puts her together. So God builds Eve, he builds people. God builds dynasties. So in 1 Samuel 2, God says, "I'm going to raise up a prophet who will serve me faithfully. And I'm going to ensure that his line is always there to serve me faithfully." So God builds dynasties. He builds nations. Jeremiah says to the people of Judah, God is going to bring you back from Babylon. He's going to bring you home, and he's going to build you up, and he's going to rebuild all the stuff that the Babylonians tore down, and he's going to establish a future for you. So he builds nations. God builds stability. Jeremiah, as he's prophesying, he also prophesies to the pagan nations around Judah. And he tells them, if you will come, be obedient to our God, if you will humble yourself, if you will learn from our God, he'll build you. He'll build a place for you. He'll establish you among his people. And then, of course, God builds families. In Psalm 127, you read about God building up families. And in Hebrew, for God to build up the house of someone is to give them sons or daughters. And what I just love about all the ways that this word build shows up in the Hebrew scriptures is that you see that in every classification where God is a builder, he's more concerned with people than with buildings. You really get a sense of the builder's intent, the builder's heart. Now, it's strange that the word bana, it does not show up in Genesis chapter 1 with the creation account. However, if you read Genesis 1 through a literary lens, What an ancient person would have realized is that this pattern of a 7-day construction, where on the last day God finishes his work and then rests, an ancient person would have realized that's a temple building text. When you build a temple, that's what happens. So they would see the world in Genesis 1 as God's temple. It's almost like heaven and earth in Genesis 1, they just completely overlap and interlock. And when God builds his temple, builds his world, he takes humans and he puts them in this world. He says, okay, now I want you to make something out of this. I want you to be fruitful and multiply and rule and subdue. And you know how the story goes. Instead of filling it with goodness so that it flourished, we filled it with evil, we filled it with sin, we filled it with violence, and as a result, heaven and earth were torn apart. But because that was not the builder's intent, God, who has this relentless drive to be with his people, raises up a family, the family of Abraham, rescues them from their slavery in Egypt, brings them out into the wilderness, and he says to Moses, I want you to make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them, among the people. Make this tabernacle and all its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you. And this is an image here of the tabernacle. This is a replica that you can go visit in southern Israel at a place called Timnah. And it just gives you a sense for the size, the dimension, what it would have looked like. But this language that God uses about, I want you to build it exactly, he's very, very specific. He wants it built in a very particular way. And that is because when you start to look at the symbolism of the way this tabernacle and later the temple is structured, it's a microcosm of the world. It represents the world, and it's almost like what God is saying to his people is, okay, yes, heaven and earth have been torn apart, but I want to be with my people. And if you'll be faithful, then we'll build something together where I'm going to carve out a space where heaven and earth can overlap once again. And that's what the tabernacle and the temple functioned as. And you just get this picture of God. It has this relentless passion to build a world where heaven and earth are reunited. Now hold that in one hand and come with me into the New Testament now to look at Jesus. Because Jesus, as you well know, was a carpenter. And you probably have images in your mind of Jesus woodworking. And yet, when we look at the word for carpenter in Matthew 13:55, we're going to have to update that image of Jesus in our minds, because carpenter in Greek is this word tekton, and it means craftsman, master builder, or artisan. Now, Jesus did probably work with wood, but in Israel, there's not a lot of wood to work with. So what there is a lot to work with is stone. And so a tekton is somebody who would have worked probably much more regularly with stone. And we did an episode on Jesus's occupation as a tekton. Brad did as a part of our Rabbis and Disciples series. So we'll link to this below. I'd encourage you to go watch that. But for our purposes, I just want you to see that Jesus as a tekton, as a builder, he had three primary functions in a building process. First, the tekton was responsible for laying out the foundation, which is the most important part of any construction project. And once that foundation was laid out, the tekton would then entrust the building of the rest of the structure to a team of workers. And the tekton then would become the supervisor of these workers as they finished the house. And then once that structure was finished, the tekton would be called back to do some of the really detailed work that required a very, very skilled builder, like doors. Because when you're working with wood and stone, and wood is expanding and shrinking, getting that to go together, it just takes a really skilled builder, which a tekton was. And so you just see, Jesus is not just this poor, humble carpenter, building little wooden benches for people's homes. No, Jesus is part architect. He's part structural engineer. He's part superintendent, part skilled craftsman. Jesus knows a lot about building. And what was true in Jesus's world is true now, that the most important part of any project is the foundation, and that is what the Tekton was responsible for. And so this imagery, of the foundation becomes central in Jesus' teaching and ministry. And I just want to show you 3 passages where it plays a really, really important role. So in Matthew chapter 7, verse 24, Jesus is coming to the end of the Sermon on the Mount. He's just basically given the core teaching of what it means to follow him. And he finishes and summarizes it by saying, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. Jesus is talking about building on a sure foundation. Now, if you travel to the land of Israel, you in certain places will see things like this. This is bedrock that is exposed. It's right up on the surface of the ground. And this is what Jesus is talking about. If you want to build a firm foundation, find this bedrock and build on that, because that's going to be able to withstand the storms of life. The second one takes place in Matthew chapter 16, when Jesus brings the disciples up north in Israel to a place called Caesarea Philippi. And Jesus brings the disciples here to ask them a question. Who do people say that I am? And they give him some responses, but then Jesus presses to the point and he says, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, yes, Peter, that's it. And flesh and blood have not revealed that to you, but my Father in heaven. And then he says these words to him, I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock, I will build my church. So Jesus is going to be building a community, and of course, like a good Tekton, he plans to build it on a rock. Now the question is, well, what rock is he talking about? I mean, Peter in Greek means rock. So is he talking about Peter? Peter, I'm going to build this on you. Is he talking about Peter's confession that you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God? Is that what he's talking about? Or is he talking about himself? Well, let's look at our last foundation image that shows up in Jesus' teachings. And it's an image that comes out in his debates, his arguments with the religious leaders in Jerusalem. And so in John chapter 2, Jesus has just cleared the temple of the money changers, and the religious leaders are really angry, and they come to Jesus and they say, like, can you give us a sign that will demonstrate by what authority you're doing these things? And Jesus says, oh, you want a sign? I'll give you a sign. You see this temple? Like, I'll destroy it and raise it up again in 3 days. And of course, they're incredulous, and they say to him, it's taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it again in 3 days? But the temple he had spoken of was his body, that Jesus is somehow becoming the new temple, the real temple. In another passage where Jesus is having this debate with the religious leaders from the book of Matthew, Jesus asks them point blank, have you never read in the scriptures? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, one of those foundational stones at the bottom of a building that just holds the whole structure together. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Now, this passage is actually a quote from the Hebrew scriptures. Jesus has Psalm 118 in mind, but he also has Isaiah 28 in mind, where we read these words, see, I lay a stone in Zion, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone for a sure foundation. The one who relies on it will never be stricken with panic. And as Jesus is going in this back and forth with these religious leaders, he basically says to them, you see this building? Yeah, God is going to judge it. God's going to bring it down because you have misused it, and it is not a place where heaven and earth overlap. And judgment came. And in 70 AD, the Romans came to town and they toppled the stones of the temple. And you can walk along the western wall of the Temple Mount today and see those stones right where they fell. But you know what didn't fall? The cornerstones. If you just walk up the street a little farther, you'll see the southwestern corner of the temple, and you'll see stones like this, just this massive cornerstone. It's like 40 feet long, 8 feet wide, 75 tons. I mean, it's basically like a school bus, and it's still standing there. And And what Jesus is saying, he's like, hey, you have rejected me, but in me, God is building and establishing a new temple, a new space where heaven and earth are going to overlap. And I am the foundation of that building. I am the foundation of the building that God is constructing for his people. If you want to know what that looks like, it looks like this. And the writers of the New Testament pick up on this language. So Peter says, as you come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans, but chosen by God and precious to him, you also are like living stones being built into a spiritual house. We are being built on the foundation of Jesus. But my favorite passage comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where the Apostle Paul just says this, by the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as a wise builder. I love this so much. The word for wise builder is Tekton. He calls himself an architect. Jesus is the Tekton, and Paul is imitating the Tekton by becoming an architect and building on the foundation that Jesus laid. And he says, someone else is building on it, but each one should build with care, for no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ. Friends, you and I, we are what God is building. And Jesus is the foundation. If you want to build a life that lasts into the future, a life that can withstand the storms that come, build on the foundation of Jesus. Imitate him by becoming a builder yourself. Now, I just want to leave you with two simple thoughts about what reflecting the builder heart of God might look like in our lives. And the first is just this, that construction is messy. Building can get crazy, chaotic, and there are going to be times in your life where you look around and it's just going to feel like, God, how in the world are you going to make something out of this mess? God, how could you make something purposeful and good? It just feels like everything's turned upside down. There are these places in your life, situations that you've got yourself into that you just can't imagine a way out of. And you will be tempted to feel like the builder has lost the blueprint and there is no hope. But what Jesus invites us to is to focus on the foundation and to trust the Tekton. You are not God's first project. He's done this before. He is a wise builder. And if you will turn your attention to focus on the foundation and trust his craftsmanship, he will be faithful to make something beautiful out of this mess. And the second thing is this, that one of the most powerful ways that we can reflect God's builder heart is by building each other up. And Paul is going to use this language all throughout the New Testament. Build up your neighbors, build up the church, build up one another. And we just are called to build God's community, God's kingdom, by encouraging other people. I was a summer camp counselor at a place called Royal Family Kids Camp. And one of the first things that you've got to do at the camp is you got to pass the swim test. If you want to be able to swim in the deep end of the pool, you got to swim all the way across, and you get your little bracelet and you can swim in the pool all week. And I'll never forget, there was this little 5-year-old boy who desperately wanted to pass the swim test and swim in the deep end of the pool. And every time he tried, he would fail. And on his last attempt was this really strange moment where for whatever reason, everybody in the camp had turned their attention on the pool. And as this little boy started out across the pool, like a couple hundred people started calling his name and cheering, "You got this, buddy. You're gonna do it this time. You've got it in you." And I'm telling you, it was like watching their words enter into his eardrum and turn into courage. And this little boy, it's like he became a larger person with all of that encouragement. And he made it to the other side of the swimming pool. He passed his swim test. And I just was wiping tears away from my eyes. Because as everybody came together to build him up, it's like we were building each other up. It's like we were participating with God in building a place where heaven and earth could overlap. And brothers and sisters, that is what we are called to join the master builder in creating a space where people can be reunited with God, where heaven and earth can overlap. So as you go through the days and the weeks ahead, my prayer for you is that God is just going to open your eyes to ways that you can participate with Him by building other people up when they need encouragement the most. So my friends, may you walk out this text well in your life.